alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Hello and welcome to Alive After Reading, and I'm your host, Tim Niederreiter, author of several books and madman attempting to start dictation again. And with me today is John Mierau. Welcome to the show, John.
Hey, thank you very much for having me, Tim.
Well, it's great to have you. I mean, honestly, I've followed your stuff for a while, your guest appearances especially, but hey, I've actually listened to some of your podcast fiction even, which is not something I usually do. I'm not. People on this show will know I'm not really an audio podcast fan. Audio stories. I like to read my stories. I don't like to listen to them. That's just a personal preference. But John, what have you been doing lately, and what sort of stuff do you put out there in the world?
Well, from the perspective of being alive after reading or writing, I write science fiction. I write a lot of serialized material. I've been podcasting since 2009. And while some people may say my podcast has faded to every few weeks, my patrons are getting regular biweekly content. Patreon is alive and well, and my regular podcast is alive and well, but just with the reality of life, a slower pace. It's all about science fiction. I set it in 3 different worlds, and I just change it up from time to time.
Cool. I really like the variety in when I serialize stuff. I'm generally focused on doing a variety of things at a time. And I'm currently I've been serializing stuff on Kindle Vella. I'm kind of taking a break from doing the regular weekly chapter releases because that's really been burning me out. Because I had 10 serials going at once, and that's too much.
Oh.
And they each needed two updates a week to be profitable, basically, and I did it for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then I'm like, this is crazy. I need to do something different.
Yeah, I've heard that the profitability, it's quite a high level of interaction and quite a high turnover of episodes.
Exactly. I do have a plan. My new plan is to serialize one story at a time, but to serialize it every day for the course of April, because I already have the whole story written in this case. So that's a little easier. Yeah. I just release it thrice a day during April, and then at the end they have a whole novel, and then I hopefully have a decent income as well. Because the bonuses Amazon is giving out for Bella are still pretty reasonable. They're a pretty reasonable bonus. The actual royalties are a pittance. They don't make any sense. So yeah, I wouldn't be publishing stuff on Bella if there was any real restriction on publishing it later. Which there isn't, luckily. There's basically no real restrictions. So it's a very nice program if you're able to use it, because it's still, I think, a United States only issue.
Alas, I am Canadian, I know.
Yes. Well, so are many of my other guests, actually. I talked to a lot of Canadians.
So if I look you up on the podcast by tags, it's going to say Canadian-centric. Got it.
No, I mean, I don't tag very well, but sure. It should probably say that. I'm like an honorary Canadian at this point, even though I'm from Minnesota. But so John, what's your...
Well, there, yeah.
Yeah, it's close enough, right? It's almost Canada. So John, can you tell us the 3 serials you got going on and off here?
Sure. I work in actually 4 different worlds. My most largest focus of stories in the last few years has been my Far Lost series, which is almost universally serialized. Far Lost is a setting, science fiction, far future, several hundred years, but nothing to do with Earth. The conceit at the bottom of the story is anytime a race, and there are aliens, has developed a way to cheat the speed of light, or create a space warp, or fold space, whatever they try, from their point of view, their test ship goes kaboom. Massive shockwave, death, destruction. Let's not try that again, except for humans, which have tried it several times, hoping for a different result. But what they don't understand is that those ships aren't blowing up. Whether it is the universe's immune system wiping out that effort to beat the natural law of the speed of light, or whether it is a intelligence that is trying to stop it, or God sneezes, for whatever reason, all of those ships end up in the same place. In a system with a dwarf red sun that's dying in the middle of nowhere, so far away that no computer, even the living computers, can figure out how to find a way home. So it's a story about refugees and building society, building consensus, trying to build a civilization from people with very different viewpoints. And of course, there are conquerors, and there are pirates, and there are murderers, and there are people that work to actually build a civilization, all in 10 to 15 minute installations, installments.
That's really cool. I didn't know the premise behind that one actually. I've seen your like logos and stuff around. I've seen you at I've seen some. I know the name, but not a whole lot else until now. Yeah, neat. Yeah. Kind of like it does sound like. I mean, Far Lost sounds like a good branding because it does sound a little like Farscape, just for everyone, for like all the civilizations we're going to run into. Basically, are all in the same position the character from Farscape was in.
Very much, very much. The stories that I've told there, I've got stories that are full cast dramas that I release as Far Lost Signals with a lot of voice actors that you and I probably know and love from podcasting, and traditional narrations just under the Far Lost brand. And I've probably got 16 different stories now.
That's a fair number.
3 novels, yeah, and a bunch, but more than half have only been released to the patrons because through COVID and through work restrictions and through having, did I mention 3 children? My keeping the roof over the head is my first priority, and my patrons are a close second. And then I'm still keeping that podcast well fed, but sometimes a month between episodes.
Fair enough. Yeah. Do you have time to write other stuff, or it sounds like you're a busy guy as it is, but you're writing for your serials right now?
I'm writing mostly serialized because, and this is a great question, did I begin to write serialized because I was writing fiction for podcast, and that's how I was imagining it would eventually release? Or did I just find that there's a groove in serialization that I prefer, whether it's written? I've flirted with releasing episodes at a time before Kindle Vella in short form, chapters, the whole, I guess, if you go back in time, this used to be the standard of the newspapers in Britain in the 1800s. It's the latest serial. What's going to happen to Sherlock Holmes? But I really enjoy that. I really enjoy the serialized aspect. So I'm writing Far Lost, and I'm playing with another one that I put on hold for a few years because when Trump was elected president, I couldn't bring myself to write in the world. It is a world where aliens invade in the form of possessing people. And making them do crazy things and acting mad and having no reasons. Yes,
that's the one I listened to. I love that. I love the beginning of that.
Thank you. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate when your hero isn't only an anti-hero; he's a serial killer himself. But he's got good reasons, as you discover.
Very, very frightening.
Thank you. It's more frightening than most of my usual work. I really enjoyed that. There is a short story set in that world my patrons have that's going to be coming out again soon. And I'm playing with releasing on, as you are, with the YouTube as well as the podcast, as well as patron exclusives. And I'm writing a sequel to that as well.
Ooh, okay.
And I'm going to be re-releasing one of my oldest stories soon to keep that patron, the podcast fed. I'm going to be re-releasing one of my earliest full novels, Enemy Lines again.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard. That's a familiar one. I heard a fair number of ads for that one back in the day. I can tell you on other podcasts.
Yes. Thank you. I'm glad they all played them.
They sure did. I mean, I forget. I think obviously Round Table Podcast, Dead Robot Society. I think the main ones I would listen to religiously. Those ads would jump out at me on. Yeah,
I was really grateful back in the day when all of us OG and perhaps 1.5 generation podcasters really came out of the woodwork. It was a lot of fun. And then, of course, my last one is I have a shared universe that I write with other writers that I invite to work with me called Walk the Fire. The conceit is it's science fiction that plays like fantasy. It's a very simple idea that 0.5% of humanity, if they fall into a fire, don't get burned. They can actually walk out the other side if anybody's bothered to carry that fire into another branch across the city or the continent or the solar system, and immediately come out looking exactly the same as the first time they ever walked through a fire. So I get to play with immortality, a very human kind of alien, because what happens to your soul after you've been alive for 1,000 years, and how civilization spreads when it's not technology, but some kind of weird something that can't be controlled or evolved it just leaves the people to control each other and decide how to think in that new world. So that's the other setting I like to serialize, and I'll be doing more of that soon too.
Okay, yeah, that's one that I haven't read, but I loved the songs that John Adelio made for you for it. Those are so good.
Yeah, I was really happy with those. The whole idea of music to go with podcasts has been around in various incarnations, but John Adelio wrote the theme song to Mur Lafferty's I Should Be Writing. And after I heard that, I commissioned him to write for me. And he knocked it out of the park. There's 3 great songs there, all playing riffs on folk songs or traditional ballads about how, what happens at the bottom of a coal mine?
Yeah.
What happens when you need a ferryman to take you home to see your wife and kids? I really loved playing with those. And yeah, I've also commissioned some imagery, but mostly I'm a writer, and I just want to tell the story that way.
I agree. I'm more or less in the same boat there. I'm not musical, but I do all my own art and stuff nowadays, basically, or I do my cover designs at least. I'm just too cheap to commission people to do most of the characters and stuff. But especially now they've got some pretty good AI tools that now that I have some Photoshop skills built up over the years, I can mess with AI generated characters and stuff and make my own stuff. It's not as hard as I thought it was going to be, even though I can barely even hold a pencil now, let alone draw a character.
Practice makes perfect. That's what we tell everybody, writers and artists.
Yeah, definitely. It's a weird thing, but I wanted to ask you that because I've always had kind of a visual imagination. I think most people do, unless other circumstances preclude them knowing much about the visual world, for example. But I was curious about, because you're writing for audio a lot of the time, and conveying visuals is. I mean, if you're going to do it through narration, that's one thing. But are there other tricks you use in audio? I mean, I guess that to go kind of go beyond the medium in some ways. I mean, other than not beyond.
Well, when you get to audio drama, it's the same as we've all heard a 1950s radio play where someone's carrying 2 coconuts. Oh, listen, it's a horse coming down the hill. And now I take great delight in writing scenes where people are communicating, checking a screen and interacting with each other. And you hear a beep, or you hear a seatbelt release, or you hear a thump on the hull, or you hear some of these squishy footprints if they got hit in the face with something wet. That sound can create an environment. I'm also a teacher, and one of the things that you learn is that everybody learns and everybody appreciates the world from a different ratio of sight, sound, smell, experiential learning. Kinesthetic learners are the people that have to stand up and pace to remember. And poor bastards, they have to sit down to write that test, but that's the only way they can absorb that information. Some people can only understand by hearing it or by seeing it. And when you write a story, there's old pieces of advice. Always say things 3 times in 3 different ways so people can hear it. When you're trying to learn, you always try a different modality. Write it out, repeat it, use a flashcard, have somebody test your memory. And so I always try to find different ways to make the story approachable to people who have a different ratio of how they want to hear the story. Not only does that make the audience, hopefully louder, longer, wider, but it'll make my writing deeper. Whenever I'm writing something, I want to express myself as best I can. And if I'm teaching something to someone, I struggle to find 3 or 4 different ways to say it. And finally, every different student will have a different hook. And so I try to include as many different hooks to explaining setting and environment as I can in my writing too.
Oh, that's really cool. I mean, honestly, good answer and way better than my question deserved. But hey, I do my best some of the time. So John, you have this. I mean, I just like me. I mean, I write a bunch of different series, but yours, you have kind of a strong focus on the science fiction side of things, even though they're very different science fiction stories. Did you ever?
I think so.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, Tools and Means is way different than Far Lost, and Far Lost is quite different from Walk the Fire and so on.
Yeah, Tools and the science fiction, I guess, in a kind of a mercenary way. my settings are all very different because I want to enjoy different playgrounds. I don't want to have 3 different Imperial Marine stories, although I wrote an entire novel for Severed Press called Road to War. And that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed playing that. But the story itself isn't what you'd expect. I like to play with people's expectations as well. So I have Enemy Lines, and there might be a sequel coming there as well, which is actually 4 different novels that has been published on Kindle in the dusty old ages, set in modern day, with mashup in a way, with a very modern futuristic setting. I wrote an alternate universe story that was an alternate version of The War Between Worlds, The War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells, told from the story of, well, about that time, the Americans still had black slaves. So what happened if a black slave became one of the people that led the rebellion against the aliens? I really enjoyed telling that story. Again, subverting people's expectations. And if I ever do finish the sequel, I know there are people that beat me to this day. Yes, one of the heroes will be a war-weary, somewhat PTSD-addled, and sex-obsessed Marie Curie who didn't actually die. I'm looking forward to telling that story. And Tools and Means, of course. While it's also a very modern story like Enemy Lines was, Enemy Lines is it takes a lot longer to get one of those out. So Tools and Means is as I said, colored by modern events. We live in a world where trucks protecting us from the freedom of being safe from viruses talk about taking people hostage in the capital of the United States because for freedom. And we have government officers who are impeached and say, what's wrong with that? And we have people who shoot into crowds of people and are on right-wing news programs for being a hero of the people. So I wrote a story about people possessed by aliens and doing mad, inexplicable things. And why the hell would they do that? To try to give it a frame of logic and a frame of sense, and then explore how somebody not connected to that can try to make sense of the world in spite of that kind of madness, which we're all doing in a small way.
Absolutely, yeah.
Again, every one of my stories, I just want to flip it around. I want to make, and if you want to be honest, Walk the Fire is both a historical fantasy because it starts with the dawn of civilization and cave paintings into the far future where there are multiple worlds and multiple flames and some very strange looking people.
Oh my, that sounds, I mean, obviously I really love the idea behind Walk the Fire in particular, but to go back a second to the Tools and Means, you know, why do people act this way? Kind of, maybe there is an answer. Maybe there's some kind of conspiracy. Basically, is the gist of it. You know, some kind of maybe there is a reason everyone's going. I mean, these people will go crazy, and somehow it just gets accepted or whatever. You know, this bit.
I'll make sure that there's a lot of crazy.
Things? Yeah, exactly.
I'll make sure there's a lot of unaffiliated crazy.
Regardless of what you think the awful things are, why are people doing all these awful things? It's a genuine question. And also, how can people end up appearing to be so incompetent when with all the power the world is invested in them? It's a theme I've struggled with because I mean when I was growing up and I was writing my books, I've been writing since I was 13 or so, and so when I was writing especially my sci-fi novels that I've written, I'd see like, oh yeah, generally these people are going to be kind of competent because I kind of had this naive assumption that to be in power meant you had to know something about being in power, but apparently not. And now I don't have, and so it made it tricky for me to go back and look at those stories. I'm like, okay, how would I change this now? Because I don't believe this.
Going back and looking at those stories is great. And as much as Stephen King or the lowliest unpublished author wishes they could get rid of their first novel, you can't, because if you keep rewriting your first novel, you never improve. But I want to visit something you said about reading stories about people that were competent, and that's why they were put in power. I think it's really important. I said that I couldn't write any more Tools and Means while Trump was in office. Well, just today as we record this podcast, Paul Manafort was taken off a plane trying to leave Miami for Dubai because his passport was revoked because we're in the middle of the Ukraine-Russia war, folks, and we're learning that a lot of these incompetent people were not put there because of stupidity or accidents.
Right.
They were youthful idiots to break down systems. So that was uncomfortably close to the whole reason for my fiction, which was that there was a secret reason to break down systems. So,
okay, good point.
Your stories have to change.
I guess, but having generally people acting for the reasons they appear to be acting is something I've noticed is very uncommon. You know, it's rare for people to be doing what they're doing because for the reason they say in the public
Subtext
sphere.
is critical for everybody.
Yeah.
Even if you're doing what you really believe, maybe doing it for a roundabout manner. And any story in any genre that takes a hard look at how people pretend to be heroes or choose to be heroes or strive to be heroes or people see them as heroes, you have to really see people as flawed or multi-level to really get a sense of them, because no one you meet in the real world is one thing. They're laminated subjects. They're 3 or 4 different versions of what they want to be, colored by who they were told to be, who they strive to be, who they're afraid they are, what they want in secret, and what they are supposed to chase because the world says is right. And you have to take, and I try to serve, who knows what writer knows they're good, I try to serve that none of my characters are simplistic or only have one goal and are never shaken off because of their own weaknesses or their own fears. Those are the stories that are great. When you think everything's dialed in, then the hero bends down to tie up his shoelace at the wrong moment and his buddy gets killed. You know, it's that random and chaotic and sometimes very sad element is very important in stories, because nothing ever goes as you see, especially in serialized fiction.
Oh, yeah. Oh, wow. Geez, I don't even know where to go from that, because I'm trying to go in all like a couple directions at once. That's awesome. But though definitely, what I think, it may take me a while to digest that one. Actually, I didn't know I never know what it's going to be like to talk to somebody new. Basically, I mean, we've been circling each other on Twitter for a while, but I mean, to actually talk to somebody is like, wow. Sometimes I just get snowed, and I think you just did it. But anyway. This is where I was going to go. You said Heroes. You said Heroes a few times. That reminded me of this book I finished reading recently that I really, really enjoyed. I've probably mentioned it on the show over the last few weeks, because it is now one of my favorite books. I think it goes up there in one of the top books I've ever read. It's an epic fantasy novel called The Heroes, of all things. And it is about a single battle from like all these different points of view, but it is an extremely down-to-earth story wherein, for the most part, these characters are very understandable, and there's a lot of dramatic irony in that the reader will know more than any of them about why what's happening is happening, because you get all these different viewpoints on it. You know, it's pretty amazing. Joe Abercrombie wrote that one. It's definitely worth checking out if you like fantasy of dark fantasy, though, because it's not like there's magic in this one. There's no magic, no creatures really, no like elves or any of that garbage.
Well, if you go back in my podcast oeuvre, I've written stories about vampires. I've written stories about demons. I love fantasy. I just can't sustain my interest beyond fables, which is why I love a show as ham-fisted as it looked when you reflect on it now, like the X-Files or Supernatural, because they found a narrative and characters you cared about to weave through all these interesting, and maybe that's why anthologies are so popular in horror, because the ideas are there, but they're not enduring unless you just reinvent, take a new take. It's hard to evolve them because they're based upon will-o-wisp superstitions, and everyone comes up with a different take. Now the vampires are silver. Twinkly, I guess that's what it was, right?
Vampires.
But I think, and I am ready for half your audience to tear me apart. It's my weakness, not the genres, but I can't find anything in fantasy for me to sustain a series. Only one-shots.
Fair enough. I mean, I come through the screen at you because I mostly write fantasy these days. But
I
no, I don't feel
sorry.
I don't
It's
feel
my fault.
It's
fantasy. It's not you.
Thing.
Fantasy. It's me.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I understand that. I mean, it's a tough, and obviously every writer likes what they like. You know, I mean, and writing what you like is important to being a writer. At least if you ask me, anyway. I
have a lot of fantasy I haven't shared.
Yeah, go on.
I need to get better. I have a lot of fantasy I haven't shared. And a lot of people say Ferryman is closet fantasy, like Star Wars is closet science fiction. You've got a fire you can walk through, and all of a sudden you're immortal? Okay, so maybe there's a Highlander vibe there with little Michael Jackson head on fire, but I really enjoy that setting because it allows me to play with people change. And it's really easy in a short term to not notice how much you're changing until you look back. And nothing like being 1,000 years old to realize, oh, you've become an unfeeling alien automaton, or, oh, you suddenly realized how important every little life is. And how did you get from A to B? That's joyful to me.
No, that again, I'd recommend it's as a standalone book.
The Heroes,
is
Joe
amazing.
Abercrombie. I will be looking.
That sounds like it'd be perfect. I mean, I keep trying to get Paul Cooley to read that kind of book too. He swears he hates fantasy, but I think if you read any Abercrombie, he might change his mind about some fantasy, not all.
Well, he likes fantasy, and if Paul's listening, Paul, fantasy. I say horror is just fantasy.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, hey, especially his original horror stories that I read and listened to back in the day, the Garaga stuff. Definitely fantasy, historical fantasy.
I guess it's not a very big secret, but if you ever go back and listen to Closet Treats, the audiobook is narrated by F. Ian DeMaster. Ian DeMaster? It's actually me.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I need to go check that out.
I love that story, and I really wanted to narrate that one. I also, not only do I like fantasy, I like comedy. I try to put elements... especially if you've listened to any of my Far Lost Signals, there's several buddy comedies in that. One of them is Phil and Dave, two great podcasters of great fame who are pretty much spies for hire, working behind enemy lines in like a military organization. I really enjoyed writing those. Getting comedy into a serious setting is really hard for me. Maybe almost as hard as writing a fantasy that I really think is worth sharing with the world. So the things that are hard, I want to chase.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I don't like writing traditional style fantasy, right? That's not generally what I do. And some people have accused me of having a wild imagination or a crazy amount of creativity, but really it's just that I want my story to be different from everyone else's. I want it to be obviously different. So I don't want to settle on, I always do that through the world because I like making worlds so much. Pretty much on some level, the world's always got to be strange, whether it's a pillar universe for my science fiction setting, or just a fantasy setting where the demons are actually in charge and they run things.
Nice. So long as they're not bureaucrats, because then it's just going to get
they're
nasty
bureaucrats.
Fast.
It's not good.
Oh no!
They're bad.
But when you talk about comedy. And you talk about Joe Abercrombie's Heroes, it makes me think of a very funny version of a new show. Not the greatest show, but a joyful little light beverage to consume. The After Party on Netflix.
Haven't heard.
I think it's Netflix. Go back and look. It's a murder mystery told over 8 episodes. And each episode, the detective interviews one of the suspects who shows you his version of what happened the fateful night there was a murder. And you get to follow along and see the differences, see the similarities, see how different personalities filter the same events. And I have a lot of fun with that. I like that concept very much. In fact, it reminds me of one of my older series I've written. I'm pimping myself, but it's a show where I'm supposed to be talking, so I guess it's okay.
No, it's fine.
I have a series called Last Man Home, and it's about a war vet of an interstellar war long after the war's over, and he's back to living his PTSD existence, and all of his buddies that have left war, and one of them owns a gym, happens to be a short alien with a dog. One of them, he just loves to hang out and be friends. Turns out he's a lizard that's kind of cowardly. And then at the 8th reunion they have after the war, who shows up but a guy that's going by the same name as his dead lieutenant from that war. But Tom's not actually Tom anymore. Tom's is this giant 8-foot alien with lobster claws. That was the species they were fighting. Why do you have the name of my superior officer, and how can I kill you quickly? And then you find out you're rooting for all people for a different reason as you go through this story.
Oh, wow.
So
okay.
Perspective and humor are 2 great ways to make believable characters in events. Just like
Absolutely.
I talked earlier about changing up and breathing and smelling and thinking and feeling to give people different perspectives and access points as the reader or listener into the story.
Characters with attitude. And not in the sense of have the leather jacket or whatever, but having an opinion on stuff is a great way to start with a character, I think.
Absolutely.
But but you can go so much deeper, like you've just been suggesting. You can go all over the place. And I also love that. I love it when I can laugh either at or with every character in a book, point of view wise, especially, or where even the character who's like maybe the ultimate villain of a giant fantasy setting can have somebody kind of make a joke at their expense and just have to grumble along with it occasionally. That is really cool. And that's another reference to the Heroes, mind you. But yeah.
Well, a James Bond villain is awful classy, but people prefer a little bit of, Dr. Evil in their bad guys. Yeah. And your hero could be an, immortal badass killer like Blade from Marvel. But he still better be able to laugh at itself or trip once in a while, or he's not going to be accessible to the people that want to follow along with him.
Exactly. If you can't, I mean, it's one of those things that, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the Marvel franchise movies right now, but those movies, it made sense to try to have some fun with the characters, right? Just to at least put a veneer of fun over everything is kind of a good technique to start with. But it's not. But
I don't think you can have
it does
deep
run dry
pathos.
eventually. It runs dry and gets old, which is my main
I
problem.
don't think you can have deep pathos without
Yes.
deep humor and deep humanity.
I agree. Well, John, we are out of time, and I've agreed way too much, but hey, that's fine. It's been a lot of fun having you on the show. This show runs fast, runs short. It's all good. Tell people where they can find your work, and where maybe your Patreon, whatever you want to pimp right now. We've been pimping a lot, but I mean, you can just one last round of it.
I'm glad to know that I still have pimping skills. I don't think I've given an interview since before COVID. Servingworlds.com. Patreon.com/servingworlds. That's where everything. Twitter @servingworlds. And I burned my Facebook account a long time ago.
Good for you. Anyway, as for this podcast, this, John, has been a lot of fun. As for this podcast, you can find us at mentalcellarpublications.com. You can find all my books on amazon.com, and I don't have a lot else, other things to point out, but there's a new serial coming, and I'll get you the title of that soon. It's coming in April, so it's just right around the corner. And this serial is going to be on Kindle Vella exclusively, at least to start with. But who knows? Maybe there's a podcast in the works there as well. We'll
Do
see.
it, Tim.
It involves sea creatures.
Do it.
Alien sea creatures. Yes. Yeah, it's a fun one. But it's also utterly bizarre. And like most of my work, as you'll discover if you ever pick it up, folks. So thanks for listening, everybody, and take it easy. Stay safe out there, and I'll talk to you again soon.
That tears it.